to soak so much damage. It's not really like sapping Ragnaros feels like a great play most of the time, but the opening hand's actually pretty good for both players.
Particularly, I think, for Deerjason, this is a fantastic looking hand here. He has the Fiery War Axe to answer a potential 3-3. He can then tempo out with that weapon on a following turn to take out a Tomb Pillager or an Azure Drake, using that ping to do the 1 extra damage. He has Bloodhoof Brave for a solid minion to develop. And he has that Harrison Jones for some card draw and to deny some tempo from the rogue weapon as well. So his hand is looking very, very rosy right now.
Yeah, and how often would you say you actually just go for the Harrison on a potential 1 durability dagger with no deadly poison, just to keep the sort of speed up if you don't really have another turn 5 play, for example?
If you don't have another minion to develop, I think you absolutely take it. Just use it as an Azure Drake. That's totally fine. You know, an Azure Drake with an extra point of damage, sure. Most of the rogue decks are limiting the deadly poisons that they have, so that's not a big deal. Obviously, no Tinker Oil in the format anymore. So I think that's absolutely reasonable just to slam it on a 1-2 on a 1-1 dagger. But you're looking for a 1-2. If you get the Dream Deadly Poison as well, then that's fantastic.
As you said, is looking pretty decent for Napoleon as well, though. You know, he has all the early stuff you just want in a lot of matchups as Rogue. You know, the backstab SI, and quite importantly, the coin as well, which is very important in for Rogue overall. And even the Violet Teacher can be kind of awkward for the Warrior to deal with.
Yeah, the Violet Teacher is really nice here. It's a hard read for Napoleon to make because you're scared of slam in this situation. The second Blood to Ichor being picked up is a big deal because, as I described the way these hands could interact, the Fiery War Axe plus Blood to Ichor play was to deal with 4 health mid-game minions, the Tomb Pillagers and the Azure Drake. Doesn't quite interact with the Violet Teacher in the way he would like, but that second Blood to Ichor is a very big deal on that front.
Yeah, Deerjason now being able to get the Bloodhoof Brave down, and I think the next turn or so we might even just see the Harrison, because I think what the Warrior wants to do now is to just stay 1 step ahead constantly of the Rogue and just always keep the minion on board and make the Rogue answer every single turn. And then when you get to cards like Cairn and Ragnaros and Varian as well, you know, it just becomes too much for the Rogue and just you just overpower them on the board.
Yeah, Deerjason has actually gotten a little bit quicker with his build of Midrange Warrior. He doesn't have the Varian in there. He tops out at Ragnaros. No Refarm, no Varian, so doesn't have that huge threat at the end, but still, the analysis is spot on. You need to have board dominance before your big threats start coming down. Otherwise, your individual big threats are too vulnerable to sap, and the Rogue can just swing themselves back into the game.
Yeah, we did see Harrison go down as well, which drew into one of those big threats, the main one we were talking about, into the Ragnaros. And Napoleon now having a lot of tokens on board as he does backstab the Harrison there. And he does actually have a pretty easy way to deal with Bloodhoof. Sometimes you just can't deal with that guy.
Yeah.
And like that half dealing with it, you know, like, okay, I'll damage it and then deal with it next turn. A lot of the time feels terrible because, as we can see, it does get enraged to deal 5 damage as well. So did get rid of it pretty nicely, used the tokens to clear up the Harrison, and suddenly Napoleon is on pretty strong board.
Certainly is. Deerjason will be begging for a Ravaging Ghoul just about now. Doesn't pick one up. Does have an Acolyte, which he can cycle a bunch of cards with those Blood to Ichors, but the Violet Teacher might just demand an answer here. He has the option to play something like Blood, Fierce Monkey, be able to take out the Violet Teacher and get a pretty competitive board. He essentially gets himself a 2-2 for every 1-1 that's in play, and then has a 3-4 to dominate the 3-3 as well. So it's a very, very competitive looking board.
Yeah, this was really important for Deerjason here to be able to just build the board back up, because if he was forced into just like playing Cairn, there's just like a straight up sap as he does come into his hand potential. But also, Azure Drake into Prep Fan just swings the board back in Napoleon's favor, and again it's just yet another turn where it's like, okay, the Tempo Warrior is now got no board, does have the weapon to clear up the SI potentially, but and then just always going to be 1 step behind. Cairn's going to come down, but as we said, we can see the sap already in hand, and that is a huge turn loss.
Napoleon actually physically punched the air at seeing Cairn Bloodhoof hit the board.
Ooh,
incredible. He's going to cycle the shiv, but this is the feeling of a rogue player. You have double sap in hand, you are begging your opponent to play clunky minions like Cairn. Napoleon celebrates quite rightly. He knows how much this means. If he wins this game, he is 1 game away from America's championship, and his emotions are coming out quite rightly now.
Yeah, both these players very sort of active on camera, but even the SI like setup to follow it was perfect. Like, you know, much better than Dagger. Grom is going to come down now to deal with his Azure Drake. There is
Not
Leroy
good
and
enough.
Abyss in hand though.
Leroy FS is going to wrap this game up. Napoleon is riding his wave of emotion. He is picking up all the momentum right now. And despite that fantastic-looking opening hand from Deerjason, I think that Violet Teacher just proved to be so key. He played it down on a turn. Deerjason did have the possibility to answer it with the double blood to Ica, as I described, but he just felt like Harrison was just a much stronger play on that turn, which I almost certainly agree that it was. But then that let that Violet Teacher stick for the turn, develop the board, and the game swung from there, and honestly also swung hugely on that preparation draw, which was kind of disgusting. A little bit of sick actually came up in my mouth.
Wow, that's a little bit extreme for me. I was more okay with it personally, but also it was kind of crazy that that's like one of the few games the Warrior doesn't have a whirlwind effect from Ghoul or whirlwind itself. You know, all the time you're building up these 1/1s and you just think, well, yeah, you know, the Warrior plays at least 3 whirlwind effects normally, so the odds are it's going to come down and clear up the board, which would have made it much easier to come back from. But again, the Warrior just wasn't able to just keep anything stuck on the board as Napoleon managed to just clear everything up very easily, and it looks like he is just left with his Shaman. So it's a mid-range list, but if I was him, I'd be feeling pretty happy about this. The Shaman's in a fairly strong position against the field at the moment.
Shaman is a difficult deck to 3-0 for sure. It's a hard deck to come back against. Honestly, having looked at the last series, though, I would say the same thing, perhaps even more so. Freeze Mage is a very difficult deck to 3-0 because it's so polarized.
Yep.
There's a chance that you have 1 or 2 decks in your lineup that Freeze Mage just beats. And we saw in the last series that just because you are unfavored in matchups, just because you're playing against a deck that's kind of odds-on to pick up a win, you're odds on, but there are still odds on the other side that you can come back. And that is what Jason will be counting on in this situation. He knows he has an uphill battle, but he also knows how important this is, the stakes that are on the line. And there isn't much to this at this point. He has to win with all 3 of his decks. He has to beat the same deck every time. So he just has to mentally compose himself, plan out how he feels best doing about this. That's really the only consideration here. Yeah, and then just go 1 game at a time.
We are going to see which deck he is picking first, because this always interests me. When you're in this situation, you have 3 decks to choose from. Yeah. Do you go with the one you think you've got the best chance with, the worst chance? You know, it's really like, I think it's a really interesting insight into like the mental state of the player.
Right, this is exactly what I'm saying. There is almost 0 strategical consideration in this point in terms of what you play first, because the only thing that you fall back on in situations like this is revealing information, and that is not a factor in a revealed deck list format. So it's entirely a mental thing about, you know, what do I feel most comfortable with here? How am I going to go about doing this?
Yeah, and Deerjason must be feeling pretty comfortable at the moment with his opening hand, as he has the Flame Imp into potential Peddler or Juggler, Coin Gang Boss, everything he really needs to open up against the Shaman here.
And I'll tell you what is a really big deal right here. I was about to say this matchup very often comes down to how many Lightning Storms you are running in your mid-range Shaman. Napoleon is running a number which he would probably be regretting a little bit just about now. He is running 0 Lightning Storms in his mid-range Shaman, which is going to give him some serious issues against Zoo specifically, but may help him out in some of the matchups later on.
Yeah, I think in control matchups you don't really care too much, and that's probably the reasoning. You know, like, I'm presuming the overall format is going to favor control, so I'm going to just absolutely demolish that with this deck. But I agree, the lack of Lightning Storms, I mean, 1 Lightning Storm can pretty much just win you this matchup pretty easily.
Yes, indeed, but there are threats for days. Fully respect the Hex on the Darkshire Councilman. It's pretty much the biggest threat in Zoo's deck these days. There's no Doom Guards that you Hex in most people's lists. Everyone's just running Leroy, which only really comes out when it kills you.
I was going to say, Hexing Leroy might be a little bit too late.
Yeah, so the 3-drop may not seem like the best target to Hex, but it is one of the biggest threats in the deck, so it makes a lot of sense. And he's just going to go for Temple Primal Fusion here, just to be able to make a more competitive board. But you can see already Napoleon already shaking his head here. He knows this game's very quickly going away from him, and this is a mental consideration for him, honestly, because he has to stay composed.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we've seen, you know, he's very, very emotional about the game, which is fantastic, but I think he needs to keep in his mind, he has 3 goes at this, right? Yeah. You know, 1 game might not go well, but you've got 2 more, and just odds on that you're going to draw really well and play well in one of those games and take the win. So he just needs to stay confident. He's completely not out of it yet as he plays the thing from below for pretty nice 3-mana 5/5 taunt. Always feels pretty good.
Does seem very solid. The Abusive Sergeant that was picked up from the Dark Peddler here, though, is going to be absolutely destructive to this. Has the Sea Giant to follow up. And this is the one thing that can make you regret using a Hex. Of course, we saw from Deerjason he's running double Sea Giant in his list, so I guess there's slightly more consideration to holding onto a Hex than usual, but I think he had to react to that Darkshire Councilman in the way that he did. Does get punished by the Sea Giant, and I think we will see Napoleon scooping out of this game sooner rather than later here.
Yeah, and again, I completely agree. I think there we go. In defense of the Hex, the second you let Darkshire Councilman just chill on the board, is you lose to that instead
it just
of the
becomes a Sea Giant anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So definitely a rough matchup there for Napoleon. But again, as we said, 2 more games. He's got the Warrior and the Freeze Mage to play again.